In the ancient heart of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved a cradle for civilization, rose the empire of Babylon, a city of gods, kings, and mysteries. Its towering ziggurats, adorned with gold and lapis lazuli, reflected both divine ambition and human arrogance. Among the countless rituals that filled the city's calendar, few were as controversial, as secretive, or as disturbing as those conducted by the priesthood of Ishtar, the goddess of love, war, and fertility. To outsiders, Babylon was a place of wonder. To those within its walls, it was a world ruled by priests who claimed to speak for the gods, who decided what was holy, and who demanded unquestioning obedience. The Temple of Ishtar stood as the beating heart of Babylonian religion, a place where heaven and earth were said to meet. Every stone was soaked in ritual meaning. Every ceremony had a purpose, to ensure fertility, victory, or the favor of the divine. Yet beneath the chants, the incense, and the rhythmic beating of drums, something far darker lingered. Among the many duties of the priesthood, one practice stood out in ancient writings, particularly those of Greek historians like Herodotus, the so-called sacred prostitution, a ritual in which virgins, both male and female, were forced or persuaded to offer themselves in the name of the goddess. The ceremony was often described as an act of divine union. Young initiates, chosen for their beauty and purity, were told they had been selected by Ishtar herself. They were dressed in ceremonial garments, adorned with oils and perfumes, and led into the inner chambers of the temple. There, under the watchful eyes of priests, they were instructed to surrender their bodies as offerings to the goddess. To the priests, this was not an act of lust, but of sanctity, a ritual meant to mirror the union between heaven and earth, between the mortal and the divine. But for the initiates, many of whom were barely adults, it was a nightmarish loss of innocence cloaked in religious reverence. Herodotus, writing centuries later, claimed that every woman in Babylon was once required to sit in the temple of Ishtar and offer herself to a stranger as part of her duty to the goddess. While this account has been heavily debated and likely exaggerated, it reveals something crucial about how outsiders perceived the Babylonian religion, as one that intertwined sensuality with sanctity, pleasure with pain. The male virgins, less frequently mentioned, were said to be reserved for special rites, particularly those connected to the male deities who symbolized fertility and rebirth. In some retellings, these young men were chosen to represent the dying and resurrected god Tammuz, Ishtar's divine consort, a role that often demanded symbolic suffering or ritual submission. Inside the sacred precinct, the atmosphere was heavy with smoke, chants, and trembling belief. The priests held absolute authority. Their words were the voice of the gods. They would invoke Ishtar's presence, calling upon her dual nature as both nurturer and destroyer. The rituals were designed to release divine energy into the city, to guarantee harvests, fertility, and stability. Yet in achieving this supposed divine balance, the priests used human bodies as vessels. Male initiates were often treated as instruments of ritual energy, stripped of individuality and remade as symbols. The act itself, whether literal or symbolic, carried with it immense psychological and spiritual weight. The young men believed they were touching the divine. In reality, they were being consumed by a system that demanded flesh to sustain faith. In later Mesopotamian texts, echoes of these rites appear in myths where gods and humans blur into one another, where sacrifice is seen as a path to transcendence. Ishtar herself is portrayed as a goddess who both blesses and destroys, who demands devotion and punishes rejection. Within this mythic framework, the priests justified their practices as necessary for cosmic order. The virgin's purity was not his own. It was a tool for the gods. The act of surrender was called holy service, the violation called divine union. The language of worship disguised the reality of exploitation. What makes these accounts truly horrifying is not only the physical nature of the rituals, but the psychological structure behind them. The young men were raised to believe that resisting the priest's commands meant defying the gods themselves. The temple was the center of life, power, and morality. To be chosen by the priesthood was an honor, and refusal meant disgrace, or worse, divine punishment. In such a world, consent was meaningless. Faith became a weapon, and fear was the chain that bound every initiate to obedience. The priests, robed in white linen and gold, walked as intermediaries between mortals and deities, but their power was deeply human, rooted in control, hierarchy, and submission. Some modern historians argue that Herodotus and others may have misinterpreted symbolic rituals or mistranslated temple customs. They point out that cuneiform records rarely mention the kind of temple prostitution described in Greek accounts. Instead, they suggest that what took place was more metaphorical: rituals of symbolic marriage, fertility dances, or offerings made in representation rather than in flesh. Yet even if the stories were exaggerated, they reflect an enduring truth about ancient religion, the way it often demanded total surrender of body and soul, and how easily that surrender could be twisted into abuse when power was unchecked. For centuries, the legend of Babylon became a warning in later civilizations. Biblical prophets described it as the mother of harlots, a city drenched in sin, where sacred and profane merged into one. The Temple of Ishtar stood as a symbol of human corruption, where desire was sanctified and innocence was sacrificed. Whether literal or mythic, the rituals associated with Babylon's priesthood have endured in memory because they reveal something unsettling about human nature. The ability to justify cruelty in the name of faith, to transform exploitation into worship, and to call darkness divine. Imagine the scene: torches flickering against carved stone walls, the air thick with incense, and the hum of hymns in a language long dead. The young man, trembling, steps into the chamber, his body painted in sacred oils. Before him stands the priest, draped in ceremonial cloth, eyes cold and unblinking. The priest recites a prayer to Ishtar, invoking her power, her hunger, her command. The initiate bows, not to the man, but to the goddess he has been taught to fear and love. What happens next will never be written in clay or stone, but its echoes would haunt every civilization that followed. In Babylon, the priests believed they were maintaining cosmic order. They saw themselves as keepers of balance between life and death, fertility and decay, divine will and human frailty. But in their pursuit of that balance, they crossed a moral boundary that time cannot erase. The rites of the temple blurred the sacred and the profane until they were indistinguishable. What was called worship became violation. What was proclaimed holy became horror. Today, archaeologists continue to uncover fragments of the truth: clay tablets, temple inscriptions, and myths that paint a complex picture of Babylonian spirituality. But even as the facts remain uncertain, the legend of the priest's rituals persists, whispered through centuries as a tale of faith gone wrong. It reminds us that the greatest atrocities are often committed not in defiance of belief, but in its name. Thus, when one looks back at Babylon, it is not just the grandeur of its architecture or the brilliance of its mathematics that lingers in memory. It is also the shadow of its temples, the silent cries of those whose bodies were turned into offerings. Whether myth or memory, these stories of ritual exploitation stand as one of history's most haunting reflections of how power, faith, and fear can intertwine to create acts that are truly horrifying. In the ritual heart of Babylon, some of the most unsettling acts attributed to the priesthood involved ceremonies of symbolic castration and subjugation. These rites were rooted in the belief that to serve the gods, one had to surrender entirely: body, will, and identity. The male initiates, often chosen for their youth and purity, were told that their sacrifice was sacred, that by relinquishing their manhood, they were drawing closer to the divine. It was not seen as cruelty, but as purification, a stripping away of earthly desire to embody spiritual devotion. The priests taught that masculinity represented chaos and mortal temptation, and to silence it was to invite divine order. The initiate would be dressed in ceremonial robes, his hair bound in gold thread, his body perfumed with oils, and led into the inner sanctum of the temple where the act would take place. The chants that filled the air disguised the horror of what was to follow. To outsiders, these ceremonies were whispered about as mutilations. To the priests, they were transformations. The act of emasculation was both literal and symbolic. Some endured physical wounding, others ritual humiliation that marked them as spiritually neutered. Those who survived became servants of the goddess, stripped of identity and remade into symbols of divine obedience. They were no longer men, nor fully human in the eyes of their peers, but sacred beings who existed between genders, their bodies bearing the mark of devotion. The priests would parade them during festivals, their voices high and trembling as they sang hymns to Ishtar, their loss turned into spectacle. The people bowed, believing these attendants carried the favor of the goddess, unaware or unwilling to see the suffering beneath the painted faces and gilded robes. This act of ritual subjugation was not unique to Babylon. It echoed across ancient Near Eastern cults, but in Babylon, it was refined into a system of power. The priesthood controlled not only the souls of the city, but its very definition of purity and faith. To be chosen for service was an honor and a curse. Families would sometimes offer their sons willingly, believing it would bring divine favor or wealth. Once taken into the temple, the initiate's old life was erased. He was renamed, redressed, and indoctrinated into the mysteries of the gods. In time, he learned to smile during the festivals, to dance in the temple courts, and to repeat the mantras that called his pain holy. What makes these acts truly horrifying is not only the violence itself, but the belief system that sanctified it. The priests turned suffering into ceremony, subjugation into salvation. The young men who lost everything were told they had gained eternity. Their mutilation was recorded as devotion, their cries reinterpreted as hymns of faith. It was a system that fed on fear and faith alike, where obedience was measured by the depth of one's sacrifice. In these acts, Babylon revealed one of the oldest truths about power, that when religion becomes absolute, it can sanctify even the destruction of the human body. And in those silent temple halls, beneath the chants and burning incense, the echoes of those who surrendered everything to the gods still linger, reminders that devotion, when twisted by control, can become the most exquisite form of horror. In the twilight of ancient Babylonian power, a darker form of priestly ritual emerged, one that merged sacrifice, symbolism, and fear into a single, chilling spectacle. This was the practice of offering human life, often that of a young male virgin, as a substitute for a king's sins or to appease a wrathful deity. The ritual was built upon the belief that the gods demanded purity to cleanse impurity, that innocence could balance guilt, and that only untainted flesh could atone for the transgressions of rulers or entire cities. The priests stood at the center of this doctrine, claiming the power to decide who would die for the salvation of all. What began as an act of devotion became an instrument of terror, an offering drenched in blood and divinity. These sacrificial ceremonies often took place during times of crisis, famine, plague, or war. When omens foretold doom, the high priest would declare that the gods were displeased. The solution, they said, was a substitutionary ritual. A human being, chosen for his purity, would symbolically carry the sins of the nation. He would become the substitute king, or the sacred victim. For days, sometimes weeks, the chosen youth would be treated as royalty, bathed in perfumed oils, dressed in silk robes, fed with the finest food, and honored by the temple attendants. He would sleep in chambers once reserved for the monarch himself, unaware that his luxury was only a prelude to death. When the day of the ritual came, he would be led before the statue of the god, the air thick with incense and chants that masked the dread. The priests would anoint his forehead with holy oil, place a golden crown upon his head, and proclaim that his spirit would ascend to the heavens as an offering of renewal. Then, under the gaze of hundreds of believers, the blade would fall, and his blood would be declared sacred. This ritual, sometimes referred to in later writings as the substitute king rite, reveals how the Babylonian priesthood wielded both spiritual and political power. In theory, the ritual protected the true ruler from divine wrath. The sins of the land were symbolically transferred to the victim. In reality, it allowed the priesthood to manipulate kings through fear of the gods. The priests controlled who would be sacrificed, when, and for what purpose. At times, they used it to remove political threats or demonstrate divine dominance over the monarchy. Every death was justified as a celestial necessity, every scream a sacred hymn. In some myths and late accounts, the ritual was said to involve humiliation before death. The chosen male was stripped of his royal garments, whipped with sacred reeds, and forced to recite prayers for the forgiveness of the king. The priests told him that through his suffering, Babylon would be purified. His tears became the city's rain, his blood the promise of future harvests. It was said that the gods smiled upon those who died willingly, but how willingly could one submit when surrounded by chanting priests and a city that believed your death was salvation? The priests called it a sacred substitution. Modern minds would call it cruelty sanctified. The theological logic behind these rituals was simple yet terrifying. Purity had value only when it could be consumed. The male virgin symbolized untouched perfection, his body unblemished, his spirit untainted. To destroy him in ritual was to feed that perfection back to the gods, to restore the cosmic order through annihilation. The priests, in their ornate garments, believed they were performing an act of cosmic balance. They were cleansing the world through blood, ensuring that the divine and mortal realms remained in harmony. But each sacrifice made them gods in their own right, deciders of life and death, mediators of salvation. These rites left deep scars on the collective psyche of Babylon. Even after the fall of the empire, stories of human sacrifice continued to circulate in myths and commentaries. Some later texts suggested that over time, the blood of animals replaced human offerings, a transition that hinted at a growing unease with the practice. Yet the shadow of those early sacrifices lingered in Babylonian memory and echoed in later traditions across the Near East. The idea that one innocent life could redeem many would reappear throughout history, in theology, in kingship, and in myth. To stand in the temple during one of these sacrifices must have been an experience of both awe and horror. The priests' chants rose like waves, the scent of burning oils filled the air, and the golden statue of the god seemed almost alive in the torchlight. The chosen youth, trembling but resolute, was raised upon the altar. As the ritual dagger flashed, silence fell, followed by cries of worship. The blood pooled at the feet of the statue, and the priests collected it in bowls of bronze, sprinkling it upon the altar, the walls, and even the crowd. They declared that the gods were satisfied, that the curse was lifted, that life could begin anew. Yet in the faces of those watching, one could imagine a haunting realization that the divine demanded too much, that salvation had come at too great a cost. In the centuries that followed, Babylon's grandeur faded, but the memory of its rites endured as both fascination and warning. Historians, prophets, and poets alike would speak of its cruelty cloaked in devotion. The priests who once ruled the city's spiritual life became symbols of the corruption of faith itself, how belief can justify the unthinkable, how ritual can transform murder into holiness. And so, the horrifying truth remains. In their pursuit of cosmic balance, the Babylonian priests turned purity into currency, innocence into sacrifice, and the altar into a throne of fear. The blood that flowed through those temple floors was not just the price of faith. It was the measure of how far humanity could go when power hides behind the mask of the divine.